Today, I'd like to talk about gender representation in Walt Disney's The Haunted Mansion attraction. And wait, this is not a hit piece hot take on this 50-year-old attraction. I am not here to condemn this beloved piece of Americana, but to praise it. I think it does pretty well in this regard, especially when you compare it to its sibling attractions, which opened around the same time. But more on that later. Now, there are women all over the mansion, and they have rather significant and meaningful roles. They're in positions of leadership, they have names, they have characteristics, they have motivations. In other words, they're not just there for decoration, even though they technically are decorations. So some ground rules. First, I'm only talking about the original flavor classic haunted mansions, such as you find in Anaheim, Orlando, and Tokyo. I am not talking about the holiday overlay, because I never want to talk about the holiday overlay. Nor am I talking about the Phantom Manor in Paris, which it's on a whole other path. And I don't want to talk about that either. Second, and I want to be respectful, but I am only counting human or humanoid entities. Therefore, I'm not counting animals or beings that are ambiguous or whose sexual dimorphism is not immediately apparent to my admittedly limited eye. To such beings, we honor you, but I am not including you in this video. So what is the Haunted Mansion? The idea is that it's a retirement community for ghosts. It's a place for them to go in a rapidly changing world. Now, the old world was once filled with many a stately manor. All these Downton Abbey type places that had family legends and ghosts that would haunt the halls and rattle chains and hang out in the graveyard. But in the 20th century, those places started to come down. There were the world wars, the changing economic systems, probably Thatcher, turning them from estates in the American sense, like we have a family estate, to estate in the British sense of like, oi, go scheme on the estate, innit? Oi, bruv, Tesco, Gogglebox, M1, BBC 4. It's like that Kinks song where he says, my sister grew up and lives on an estate. And I'm thinking, she must have done pretty well for herself. Why does he sound so sad? You know who does look like he belongs on a British estate? New improved Figment from Journey Through Imagination, or whatever it's called now. So these ghosts are displaced because they tore down their house and now they're having a massive music festival there. Walt Disney is offering them a place to go. Now he says, we're collecting ghosts from all over the world.
We're going to bring ghosts from all over the world.
That isn't really true. This place is super Eurocentric. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. So that's my little history lesson. But we're here to talk about the women of the Haunted Mansion. So let's get to it. Now, before we even get in the building, Orlando has an interactive queue outside. One of the first characters we encounter is a bust of Aunt Flo. That's how feminine this place is. The whole thing kicks off with a period joke. Next we meet Cousin Maud, who met her end in a conflagration, fire. She burned herself up because she uses matchsticks as hairpins. Next we see the workspace of renowned poet Prudence Pock. I am unfamiliar with her work myself, but I'm sure it's haunting. Then we get inside to the famous stretching gallery, in which there are portraits of two women. The first is a portrait of an older woman sitting on a tombstone, and at her feet is a bust of someone with a hatchet through his brain. So we'll talk more about these two in a bit. The other is one of my favorite characters in the entire mansion, ill-fated Sally Slater, the tightrope walker, who met her end by being eaten by an alligator. Slater, gator. I can relate a bit to her vibe. She looks like she has really complex thoughts or none at all. There's no in between. Next we get to the women of the changing portraits. And these include Cat Lady, Medusa, and hashtag Satanic Panic, the Witch of the Walpurgis. Walpurgisnacht. Another character I'm pretty drawn to in her non-goat, non-Baphomet form. How you doing? We're both cat lovers. With her hand of glory and little sea monkey pet. We also have another of my favorite deep-cut characters called April December, who I was pleased to see makes a cameo in the latest Haunted Mansion film. I especially love her change in attitude between May and June, where she starts off demure and virginal and like hashtag no makeup, and morphs into hashtag hot girl summer with all that eyeshadow and that wink, that suggestive wink. She's learned some things in these past few months. Now, let's get down to it, boppers. We are finally in our doom buggy, ready to roll. At this point, the mansion is still feeling us out. There's still kind of a threatening vibe with the doors and the clock and the zombie. We haven't seen any real manifestations yet because the mansion is still deciding if we are cool. That all changes when we meet our first C-suite entity, who also happens to be a woman. We enter Madame Leota's Séance room. And this is where our worthiness is judged. As the record with Ron Howard puts it, Madame Leota is a disembodied head inside a misty crystal ball. She leads an incantation to the spirits to let their presence be known. And if they respond positively, we may continue. If not, I don't know what happens. However, the ghosts do respond to our sympathetic vibrations, and thus koshered, we are allowed to join the party. Incidentally, the woman in the ball was really named Leota. Leota Tombs. True story. And the first mass materialization is a doozy. The phantasmagorical ballroom scene. The phantasmagorical ballroom scene. Now, there are far too many women at this particular ball to call them all out, but here are some of the more prominent ones. In the center, we have the birthday girl who blows out her candles and dematerializes her party guests. We have Cleopatra in a rare appearance of a non-European ghost, although she is hanging out with Mark, who is Italian. We have Granny in her rocking chair, but most importantly, we have the ballroom dancers. Now, in keeping with the theme of women running the show, keen eyes will observe that it's the women who are leading the men, not the other way around. In the waltz, one leads with one's right hand, because, as is known, the left hand is evil. Evil. Now, this was accidental because the Imagineers forgot that they would show up as a reversed mirror image when put into their projection thing, thereby reversing who was leading who. But I also say it was inevitable that such a mistake would have been made, putting the women in the driver's seat. At the waltz, 5 points of contact, 6 if you do it right. So now we make our way to visit the single most important entity in the entire place, whether it be man, woman, non-binary, or indeterminate. The big cheese, one Constance Hatchaway. Dressed in her bridal gown, Constance holds court in the topmost tower of the Haunted Mansion, holding her namesake hatchet and making puns about her favorite hobby, the old Marion chop. Constance is surrounded by the portraits of her 5 deceased husbands, whose heads vanish as you go by. The last of these is a man named George Hightower. Now, he lasted longer than the rest because Constance, like many serial killers, went into a period of hibernation, of dormancy. However, that call to violence grew too hard to resist, and in their golden years, Constance finally planted that hatchet right in his cranium. This scene is actually depicted back in the stretching room as we see Constance sitting on top of George's tombstone while at her feet is a bust of George with that hatchet straight through his forehead. Now, why is this important? Because we can assume that George, at the time of his death, was the owner of the Haunted Mansion. And since I seriously doubt Constance is the kind of person that would go for a prenup or any kind of legal protection for George's pre-existing children.
In sickness and in well.
It means that once she killed him, Constance Hatchaway became the owner of the Haunted Mansion. I think this is canon now, right? I had to check the wiki. The bride in the attic owns the Haunted Mansion. Therefore, the Haunted Mansion is a woman-owned business and as such can get WOSM certification and may compete for government contracts under Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which establishes an Office of Minority and Women Inclusion in all financial regulatory agencies. So she can find all kinds of dudes to kill with an axe. But leaving Constance in her tower, we then descend to the graveyard, where the macabre really get to dancing. This is the so-called swinging wake, the hottest party of your afterlife, and many notable women are in attendance. We've got the Queen on her seesaw and the Duchess on her swing. We've got Harriet, the opera singer. We've got our second crashed hearse of the night with the ladies having a tea party. I'm even counting this arm, which looks to me like it's wearing an 80s terry cloth tennis wristband, but is really probably pearls. And since I know how rigid the Edwardians were about gender roles, it's safe that it's a woman's arm, drinking a Cosmo. And as if to make bookends, the final entity we encounter is a woman. As the rollicking jazz combo winds down to this sort of melancholy, somber a cappella piece, we are bid adieu by an entity known as Little Lolita. Little Leota. Legend says she is not the ghost of someone who has died, but a wisp or fae of Celtic lore. Again, played by Leota Toombs, she's the voice that says, "Hurry back, bring your death certificate," before you exit and run around the building to get back in line. At least that's what I do. Now, it's worth mentioning that despite these repeated invitations to spend your afterlife at the Haunted Mansion, you cannot actually do that. There have been reports of people over the years who try to spread the ashes of their departed loved ones in the Haunted Mansion. They do not allow this, and they just vacuum it up and throw it away like any other contaminant. So unless you want your loved one to spend eternity in the Anaheim dump, don't do that.
Hey little babe, let me light your candle, cause mama, I'm sure all the henna now just around. Yeah.
So yeah, so the Haunted Mansion does pretty well with gender representation. It probably needs to do much better with other kinds of representation. Constance probably needs to establish a DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion initiative at the mansion, which she probably won't because she's a maniac axe murderer. The only non-European entities that I can find in the mansion are the Marquis de Doom, who was one of Constance's unfortunate husbands, the Mummy, although he probably spent some time in Europe first for some Victorian mummy nonsense. So I'm glad he finally made it to the mansion. And maybe Cleopatra. Her genetic heritage notwithstanding, she would probably identify as Egyptian. So we should respect that. I apologize if I'm missing any non-European entities there, but from the kings and queens and the medieval knight and executioner through the Victorian/Edwardian carriages and balls, we are firmly in Europe. Maybe even just the UK. So from all over the world, not so much. But I do want to end with a quick peek across the courtyard to see what's going on with those pirates. Yes, there are a lot of women in the Pirates of the Caribbean, but they're not having a good time. I know they've made renovations and they've made many changes, but for many decades, women were not treated very well over in the Caribbean. They were attacked and chased and auctioned off and body shamed while they were being auctioned off. So now we have our updates where the women are being chased, but for the food they carry, not for themselves. We've got red. I like red well enough. But as far as I know, and I've looked, there have been very few or no renovations to the Haunted Mansion to clean up insensitive or problematic content. And given Disney's track record with things like that, that's pretty impressive. That a Disney property from the 50s and 60s still holds up pretty well by 2023 progressive standards. I'm impressed. Thank you for joining me for this look at the Haunted Mansion, one of my favorite things. My name is David, and I will talk to you soon.